Thank you very much, Stefan, and hello everybody again. What am I going to talk about? Well, probably for about the next 15 minutes or so, I'm just going to talk at an overview level about some of the key emerging threats that we at the ISF have been tracking out to 2019. I'm being very deliberate about what I'm saying there, out to 2019. So this doesn't mean to say that you've got 2 years where you can sit there and take a huge breath and say, thank goodness for that, none of these things are going to happen. That's the first thing I'm going to do. Then I'm going to move on and talk to you a little bit about the sorts of things that you can do about them. So I'm going to highlight some problems and potentially give you some solutions. I think a number of you have also picked up some of the summaries that we've produced on that, so you can take a look through that. And then if we've got any time left, I'll take any questions. But what's the overall context for this? Well, one of the challenges that we face increasingly, both as, I think, consumers, individuals and businesses, is that we continue to produce information. That hackneyed expression, information is the lifeblood of the organisation. Well, actually, it is somewhat true. And if you look back to the 1990s, I'm told, I don't remember those days, but I'm told that things were slightly different then. The 2000s, then certainly there was much more control from a security standpoint over what we were able to monitor, to measure. We've moved very much more into an unstructured environment. We've moved into a world where the user is completely king, where the smartphone is more likely to be used as the endpoint device to access systems, irrespective of what those systems might be. And that, from an information security professional standpoint, presents us with challenges. It also opens up the risk landscape and the threat landscape in particular. So what I'm going to do now is take you through three particular themes that we've identified. The first one really looks at the issue of disruption. This is disruption to your business. Disruption because we had perhaps taken things for granted. And I'm only going to highlight two areas in here. The first, though, is the internet. The internet is a utility. You turn on the tap and you expect it to work. But what happens if it doesn't? The reliance that we have as individuals, the reliance that we have as organisations on this access to the utility has generally increased the more information that we continue to share. Why? Because everything that we do is increasingly dependent upon it. You could be sitting at the back there on a smartphone and you could be doing some online shopping. At the same time, you could be on Twitter, social media. You could also take a quick flick across into your email to see whether anything has come through from a work point of view. And some of you may even access corporate systems, all at the same time on the same device, using the internet. But what if it fails? It doesn't have to fail because a cyber criminal or a nation state has decided to take it down. It could fail because a cable has been cut through, an underwater cable, for instance. Or it could be that state-sponsored terrorists have decided that it would make some sense to try to disrupt an environment by taking the internet down. Last year, something like $2.4 billion was lost to internet outages across 18 different countries. So what can you do about that? Well, I always talk about the Estonian example in this particular instance, and some of you are probably thinking, what's he rabbiting on about now? But if you go back a number of years, Estonia was attacked by the Soviet Union. Estonia had all of its external networks taken down. It was in the run-up to an election. Sound familiar? So what the Estonians have now done, coming off the back of that, and Estonia is probably one of the most digitally enabled countries in the world today. It's also a very small one, so they have the ability to do that. But you can pretty much do anything that you want to do online in Estonia, from getting a driving license through to anything else. What they have done is they have planned for the day when their networks disappear. So they have backed up all of the country citizen data in a number of different Estonian embassies around the world. So yes, they may lose connectivity, but actually, once connectivity is restored, they are then able to access the data. So data is preserved. Connectivity goes, but data is preserved. It's those sorts of things that we need to be considering when we look at our business continuity planning around the internet. The second area that I want to take a look at is that of the Internet of Things. Internet of Things has become very much more prevalent in everything that we do. Medical devices that some of us may have inside us, for instance. Internet of Things devices that look after traffic lights, that perhaps sit in manufacturing operations that we're not aware of. The issue that we highlight out to 2 years is that of ransomware being targeted at the Internet of Things. We saw very recently the impact that ransomware can have. And there is a view that at some point over the next couple of years, ransomware will be targeted more towards the Internet of Things. Why? Because it's easy to do. What we've reached is a point of standardization on IoT devices. They all use relatively simple operating systems now that are standardized. They didn't do that before. They also are highly embedded. There's very many more of them. And so the impact that you can have is significant. And the view is that ransomware will be targeted more at the device manufacturer, not at the individuals, because no device manufacturer wants to be responsible for an IoT device going down, particularly if we're talking about it in the medical context. So disruption is certainly one of the major themes that we all need to be aware of. Moving on to the next one, which is distortion. This is about integrity of information. This is about saying we're heavily reliant upon information, but what if it isn't quite the way that we thought it was? And two themes that I want to pick up on here. The first is to do specifically with misinformation. So I've said we're all extremely active, we all share information. Social media has become the way in which we make a number of our buying decisions. We trust people online. But what if something goes wrong in that environment? I'm thinking of a particular German financial services company whose share price was very badly hit when a fake report was published alleging fraudulent activity. This was last year. It took them something like 4 months to recover in terms from a share price perspective. So the challenge from an organisational standpoint is how many organisations today include social media and attacks of that nature in their incident management response. We're all dependent upon social media. How can we guard against that? The second element is the bad guys. The bad guys, and this one probably worries me a little bit more than most of the others. We are heavily dependent upon information, we know that. We're heavily dependent upon data. We continue to produce it at an exponential rate. What happens if that integrity is changed? Just a little bit. We know that cybercriminals can live on our networks for very many days. We know that they go undetected. We know that they can create all sorts of havoc. And we also know that where there is a move in business to very much faster decision making based on artificial intelligence, based on computerized data. The challenge is how do you ensure the integrity of the data in those databases that are important to you? So I do expect over the coming years to see a greater increase again in the use of federated identity and access management systems so that we understand who is accessing what from where and when. And I think as well content management systems are going to start coming into their own in this particular space too, so that we can try to reassure ourselves of the integrity of that information. The third area is that of deterioration. And this really looks at the fact that there are certain things that happen in our environment, sometimes over which we have little control, that are being done for the best of all possible worlds, but actually inadvertently have some adverse impacts. And the first one I want to look at there is that of regulation. The constant production of new regulation, GDPR being one, and we've talked a lot about that today. But the impact of that is not whether or not the regulation is right or wrong. The impact of it is it increases the burden of compliance on an organisation. Today it's something like a day a week that most organisations are spending ensuring compliance, trying to keep up with changes in regulation. Thomson Reuters, if you're interested in looking at that in a bit more detail, produces an annual compliance-based report that looks at exactly what goes on in this particular space. It's well worth a read. From an information security standpoint, what that is doing is diverting us away from looking at issues that we would really like to focus on, such as how do we become much more cyber resilient, how do we deal with information security issues in the business and support the growth of the enterprise, into becoming more compliance-based. And we all know compliance is something that we have to deal with. So how do you get around that? Well, it's about really staying abreast of some of the changes that are taking place in regulation so that you know which ones apply. And if you're a multinational organisation, you shouldn't underestimate the size of that task. The last one here is one that I alluded to in the panel slightly earlier, which is that particularly here in the UK with the Investigative Powers Act, there is a requirement for ISPs, certainly, to hold large amounts of information. It's not just restricted to the UK. There are other countries in the world that have also introduced similar acts, like Singapore, for instance, and Australia. What we are doing is creating vats of information that are attractive to cyber criminals. The little pictures there just show you over the last few years the amount of data records that have been hacked, stolen from either ISPs or indeed government agencies. So we know that it happens. And the challenge is that if we're putting all of that data into a vast reservoir, we might as well be running up a flag telling people where to go and look. So from an organisational standpoint, what we have to do is two things. One, we can certainly lobby to make sure that some of the regulation around that is in place and that the data is being stored in a reservoir that has the right level of security, whatever that may look like. But from an organisational perspective, in-house, what can we do? We need to assess what information we are actually transferring in that medium. There may well be certain instances where we do not want to use a public ISP. And so it takes us right the way back into our data, looking very hard at how we are sharing that information, over what medium, and why we're doing it. So those are the three major themes. And one of the things that you'll have noticed emerging in all of this is that very few of those themes are purely in the realm of information risk. They overlap. They overlap into operational risk, into compliance, into legal, into technology. And this is a reflection on the way that information security in particular, and cybersecurity increasingly, has morphed from being just a purely technical subject into one that is of business importance. And we know that boards around the world are paying much more attention to it, but they're paying attention to it within the context of a number of other things that they need to get to. So cyber resilience and technology risk certainly is up there, but also it has to compete for mind share in the boardroom with a number of other risk-driven issues. And what we're starting to see is this thing called cyber fatigue in the boardroom. So here we go again, the information security guy is coming in, he's probably going to be asking me for money. Well, I've increased his budget. What's he done with it? Can he guarantee that we won't be attacked? No. Can he guarantee that the level of awareness around security will have increased across our enterprise? No. So why am I spending the money? Information security and cybersecurity in general need to be able to move out of this perception of being in a cost bucket from which there is no benefit into an environment where they are seen as being driving the business. How do you do that? It's about making sure that you understand the overall strategic direction that the organisation is taking, that you understand the way in which security can play a key role in that. Mergers and acquisitions, for instance. It may well be that there is a role for information security in that. Verizon may think so. It may well be that one of the things we need to be doing on a much more regular basis is measuring the effect of security investments, aligning the cyber risk model that we have with the way in which the organisation is going forward. And we need to align it much more with the way in which the business perceives the future and the business perceives the risk, rather than some of the ways in which perhaps we might have traditionally done so. How do you do that? One of the ways you do it is, and this is our own proprietary radar, but there are plenty of other ways out there that you can use. It's a very simple chart, which is why we use it so much. It looks at the ability of an organisation to manage a threat along with the impact that that threat would have on its business. And we use that to stimulate a conversation with business leaders that says, how exactly are we going to respond in these areas? Which are the areas we need to be focused on from a security standpoint? Where are the biggest risks? How are we going to deal with those? The second way of doing it is by establishing a cyber resilience team. that shares information up and down throughout the organisation. We talk a lot about sharing and collaboration, but very few organisations are exceptional at doing it within their own construct. It does need to include business leaders. The time to actually be engaging with public relations is not when your CEO has just made the front page because he or she couldn't string two words together to explain the latest breach that happened. But IT security, information security can't do it alone. So there needs to be a commitment from the top of the organisation to pull that together. And if we do all of that, then we still continue to have to monitor other areas. First, cyberspace in general. It is a very changing landscape. There are new attacks emerging. They aren't just single isolated attacks. They are, more often than not, a combination. Make sure that they're on your legal counsel's radar. Increasingly, that will need to be the case with regulation. Work with a PR function in advance. Do a rehearsal. How many of you have incident management processes that take you through what to do from a PR standpoint, from a social media standpoint, come the day when you have a breach or lose data? Very few. And finally, don't encourage attackers. Don't be like a particular British bank who stuck its hand up and said, "We haven't been attacked." They've now joined the rest of us. So I've talked about some of the threats. I've talked about some of the things you can do. Let me leave you with 5 key points. First, do work with the business. Do consider the different issues that I've been touching on as they relate to the way that your business is driving forward. Reassess those risks and do something about them. Change your thinking about threats. You cannot possibly cover off all of the different threats that are out there. You have to adopt a risk-reward mindset. Which are the ones that are going to cause the maximum damage to your organisation that would have a significant impact on your ability to transact business? That's where you start. Revise your cybersecurity arrangements. If you haven't done so within about the last 6 months or so, it's probably time to take another look at them. Things change that quickly. Focus on people. One of the feedbacks from the session was about the role that people have to play. We get very excited about technology and the role that technology has. The most effective piece in any security firewall is the human. How do we delay WannaCry? Some bloke. And then finally, prepare for the future. Things change very, very quickly. The future starts within about the next 30 seconds in a cyber-enabled environment. So those are just some of the thoughts around how you can respond to an emerging threat landscape. As I say, there's more information in the summaries that you've got. We're probably a little bit short of time, but Stefan, I don't know if you want to take a question or not. If not, those are all my details. If you do have any questions, you can always get hold of me on those. We also produce a number of webcasts and podcasts that you can listen to, and that's the link down the bottom there. So over to you.
Thank you, Steve. Are you hanging around?